Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest, Dr. Anais Sägesser. She is a transformative thinker and advocate for systemic change, working in the realms of societal transformation and social equity. She is the co-founder of Scaling for Good, an organization that focuses on connecting, supporting, and amplifying initiatives that promote human and beyond human flourishing. Her philosophy is grounded in the belief that meaningful societal change begins with personal transformation. This principle drives her work at Scaling for Good as well as the World Ethic Forum. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing very well. It's really a pleasure to talk to you this morning.
It's been such a long time since Kaleido, but I feel when I see everyone's face as I do these recordings, it feels as if we were just there yesterday. What has life been like for you since Kaleido, and how is Kaleido for you?
It's certainly been a very intense period since Kaleido. It's only now with the start of December that things are starting to slow down a bit, which is beautiful. But I still carry, as you said, a lot of smiles in my heart and of wonderful, diverse people who came together and, in a way, celebrated life together.
Mm. I've been thinking a lot about this conference and what it would look like to be able to bring back something with that essence back to the States. And one of the things, you've worked in academia, you've, done a whole bunch of different things and attended a lot of conferences and have also presented and done your own workshops. What would you say is one of the biggest differences and powers of an event like Kaleido versus the conventional conference that people typically go to?
Mm. So I think one thing that is really important at Kaleido is that it brings such a diversity of people together. Not only in terms of their, let's say, disciplinary backgrounds, but also in the way of, expressing themselves, also in terms of their values and what they actually stand for and where and how they engage, with the world through what types of means. So I think, typically, I would say if you go to an academic conference, of course, everyone it interacts a lot through their research, and that's how they try to bring change to the world, maybe, or not, or just answer some questions or explore some questions. And other conferences are usually about a specific topic, so there's a certain focus that is there. And I felt that this was much more open at Kaleido.
Hmm. I like this piece that you brought up about diversity because when I think about it, even some of the other conferences I've covered, if people were actually able to express their life story, I'm assuming even those environments would be so diverse because you meet people from all over the world and who do different things and think differently, but you're only really presenting yourself as I'm an academic or I'm so you have
Mhm.
to narrow down who you really are so that you can
Mhm.
kind of fit in into what this is. The difference between that and what I feel like Kaleido is that it's still the same set in some ways of diverse people who, study different things, but you get to actually be in your essence. And so in doing that, you allow people to be so much more than simply what they work as or where they come from. And you can actually be an individual, which is where I think diversity really starts to flourish.
Mm. Yeah, so I do think this is important that you don't show up in a role, but you show
Mm,
up, in your as a full person, and as a full person who is also, connected to many other communities, and you kind of bring that all into the room and into the space. And I think that is what really makes a difference because, yes, every one of us has so much more than what we usually show up with.
yeah. You gave an amazing workshop that to start off the conference where we really talked about what peace looked like, what was peace, why is it so hard to bring about? And your work has been in change and connecting that with sustainability. I'm really curious to understand what your, and this is such a broad question that takes 10 hours, takes 10 weeks to talk about, but what would you say were some of the big childhood influences that led you to care about these particular issues?
Mhm. I think, as a child, I was actually a child that had a lot of nightmares. Up until about maybe the age of 9, I would wake up every night screaming. So, in a way, there was like a high sensitivity for, what's going on, and very introverted child. So, very shy and so in the terms of educational experiences, school was easy for me. So it was more like the quiet one who would, always get top marks, but who preferred kind of to be a bit more quiet. I remember, once I think it was in grade 3 or 4, teacher asking me to scream because I would always speak so softly. And I completely refused. So I didn't do that. Um, and I think because you asked about then the link to personal transformation, and I think that only came much later for me. I had then a phase as teenager of like being quite activistic and engaging in a lot of different things. And then through my studies in business, kind of completely losing orientation in a way, going into management consultancy, things that don't really, were at my heart, but in a way that just was in a pathway that I could take. And the whole thing about personal transformation came only, I would say, in my late 20s, early 30s.
Hmm. It's always beautiful. I mean, I think about these conversations and it's so difficult to have because I've been really curious as of late to really understand people's origin stories it's because it's becoming very clear to me that when someone meets me for who I am today, there is this huge chunk of 26 years that are completely missed out and you really get to experience who someone is in that moment, but you have no context to how they even got to where they are. It connects back to, I guess, the sadness I often feel at a lot of these conferences where I'm like, okay, I get to meet all your ideas, who you are today, and you get to say all your roles, and you're this amazing human being. But what was the story? How did you get there? Because that often gives so much context to the things that someone says. And so I for every conversation I have, I'm like, I wish we could do a 10-part episode where 9 of those parts are just about history. How did you get to where you are today? And then when you finally get into your ideas, then it kind of has so much more meaning because now it's placed in a particular context. But for the brevity of these conversations, which can only usually last an hour and a half, it's so unfortunate that it has to be, subjugated to only 20, 30 minutes of the conversation. But it is so fascinating. You talk a little bit about this personal transformation coming more into your ideas later in your life, which makes me really want to ask, what is personal transformation for you? And why do you feel like that entered more into your thought process later in your life rather than earlier?
Mhm. This is a very difficult question, actually, to answer. I think personal transformation, um, for me means that you, first of all, get to know yourself, get to know your own story, look at, do some introspection, process and integrate whatever trauma there is in your own story, and go into kind of a place of really, I think Thich Nhat Hanh called it interbeing. Siegel then later on called it intra-being, of understanding yourself as part of um, something also greater than yourself, and understanding everything also as part of you. So really, for me, the personal transformation is not kind of something which can go into any direction, but it's really about changing the story of separation and acknowledging in the sense of really experiencing your interconnectedness with the
Hmm.
world. Mhm.
Do you feel like, thanks for laying that definition out. That actually is so amazing because I think now we have a foundation to move on with the conversation. But do you feel like this form of personal transformation is something that naturally happens to a person throughout their lifetime, such as walking or speaking, or is it
Mhm.
something that has to be stimulated some other way?
I don't think I do think for some people it happens naturally, but I also think that it is usually a process of losing it more throughout our lives. So now this is just my assumption that children would have it much more strongly than and then lose it in growing up, in being embedded in our societal system, which is very much based on an individualistic understanding of the self, and where the autonomy um, is really kind of overemphasized to a certain degree, which is, of course, it comes also from a process where autonomy or the development of autonomy is something very healthy. But then it kind of often stays at this very individualistic approach where I do think many of us need maybe some support or some nurturing in order to then go through a journey.
Hmm. So if we were to break down this concept of personal transformation, I was
Mhm.
writing something about this similarly because I actually find that the biggest issues why there's this kind of stoppage that happens from someone finding love with math, with philosophy, with physics, with chemistry, is oftentimes these subjects are taken out of context where it's just like, here, memorize this one thing just for the sake of memorizing it and just learn it in a kind of a vacuum. And it's never going to be applied to any other aspect in your life. And then kids are always like, but why? Why do we need to know this? Which is a very valid question. But it seems like when you're able to connect physics with history, with mathematics, you kind of bring together this world of knowledge in which everything is interconnected with each other. It's interconnected with the way you understand the world, you understand meaning. It no longer is just something you do inside of a classroom and you're done with. It's something that permeates through your entire experience of life, which then makes these subjects so much more beautiful and powerful than simply just here's a textbook. And so it seems like personal transformation is simply having that process, but applied to the understanding of yourself into rather than being just like a person who you are today, someone who is kind of following this lineage of, millions and millions of people who have kind of cultivated the land and the world for us to even be able to exist and have the living that we do today. Are there other parts than this kind of contextualization of yourself that are important parts of personal transformation?
Mhm. I think it's really also this, well, one important part is the joyfulness. Um, that just really came up both in the analogy that you made with the learning process. I think it's really that finding access to our inner source of joy, the pure joy of being let's say, a fully fledged human, of kind of every day of waking up, of being alive. Um, and also this, in a way, really, we talked about the connection also um, to what is around us, um, also what is within us, and then also being open for self-transcendence, for really going into this other realm and beyond what we usually experience. And I think opening up for different ways of knowing.
Hmm. I'm really curious to expand a little bit more on this third point because I've been thinking more recently about why I feel so disconnected from people in my family or just other people that I've known growing up and have grown up with. And a huge part of that I've been realizing now is even in the little bit of meditation that I've done, or what it opens up this certain spiritual aspect of existence that I think, especially when we talk about it in academia, it can come off a little wonky, or it's like, what are you really talking about? But there's something there, and I'm not sure if I have the word to really describe the experience, but you can only really experience it. But it is really understanding like how you experience rather than what it is that you experience. Like, and my question is, when you talk about this transcendence, have you had difficulties putting that into words when it comes to an academic paper or when it comes to like interacting with other people in that world who may have never had a or never really sought out an experience that can put you in that world?
Mhm. Yeah, I think there it is really about also looking, how others have written about it to kind of put it into a discourse, connect it to a certain language and discourse. And it's certainly then the personal experience, words always fall short of really
Always.
getting it because, as you say, in the end, it's an experience and it's not um, in a way meant to be transmitted through words. And words, of course, always, they elicit a kind of an imagination. Um, and then there's a risk of interchanging that with the actual experience. So yeah, it is
Mm,
difficult to write about.
mm. What are some of the things that you have I mean, how do you kind of navigate that? Because it can be so challenging.
Mhm. I think it needs some or a certain degree of humility in a way that also reflecting on why am I writing about it? What is the intention behind it? And um, is it really kind of, am I opening up pathways to others to then allow for to integrate, that way of knowing, of experiencing also as researchers? Or is it more to kind of just say that this also exists and to build an own profile around something.
Mm,
So I do feel that there is a tension there, because in academia we're often also, um, there comes something in there to write about things that have not been written about before. But especially with these kind of experiences, it's also about, um, do they serve the world, in its current state? Do they serve society, and kind of also the greater good?
mm. I mean, even the few people that you have mentioned, it is kind of cool to think about how many spiritual people who have talked about it have existed in every part of the world, and it's actually so cool that that seems to be the one thing that everyone gets to talking about before they talk about all the other things. But you said something really interesting earlier that I wanted to touch back on, which is that personal transformation seems to be something that children naturally seem to be interested and go through, and then it seems to be this whole schooling process. I mean, a whole bunch of other stuff that happens which take them out of it. One, what type of things do you think happen to make that make children lose that? And then two, what would an alternative look like?
Mhm. So thinking of my own schooling experience, I have very strongly felt that creativity was taken away from me. Um, Especially, for painting and drawing. Suddenly there was a right way to do it.
Mm,
which at home with my parents, I didn't have that, They would love anything that I do, would just be wonderful. And I sometimes think, um, the whole spirit of curiosity and creativity, which is so closely together, gets nurtured much more if we just fully accept whatever being is there and nurture the being, beyond it instead of judging. And I feel that there is a very strong emphasis in our educational system on of course becoming productive in the society, in becoming productive members of the society, whatever that might mean in different society. But a lot of it is also geared towards then being able to go into employment and into jobs, and it's not very strongly geared towards actually saying, what is your highest potential, or what is kind of what is your contribution to the world, or how could you best serve, the world. So it doesn't come from that kind of attitude, but more, from perpetuating in a way also a system where we, you know, with all the goods that also it has brought, it is also one of the most or it is the most destructive that we've ever had in terms of destroying our basis of life. So
mm,
in a way, I think these two things are very strongly linked together.
mm. It's really interesting that you say that because, when I think about so much of my art education or whatever, I really like your combining that piece with being productive because when we think about what it means to be a singer or what it means to be an artist, there's a certain understanding that it means to be a good singer. It means, and you have to define what good is. But it's interesting because it doesn't matter whether your painting sells for $1 million or zero. I mean, painting is painting. It can be a way to truly express whatever it is that you're feeling. One thing that I have noticed that can be challenging is we touched a little bit about this where, using words can be so hard to capture a feeling or an experience. But I would say the difference between someone who is eloquent versus someone who isn't is somebody who's able to, as closely as possible, express the entirety of their experience through words. And the closer you can get to that, the more powerful your relationship is with language. And so your obvious goal is to help as many, get yourself to that level. In a schooling aspect, kind of when we take that perspective, how do you think we can go about having some sort of destination in mind? Not like we have to get to here. I mean, maybe there's no destination needed, but there is a better and there is a worse in some of these things, especially when it comes to trying to express ourselves more accurately. How do we accomplish that while at the same time nurturing that creativity and not losing all of the beauty that comes with just exploring into the you need to be better, you need to be better? How do we kind of do both at the same time?
Well, I'm personally very fond of experiential learning approaches, where you really first get people into experiencing something and then only getting them into a sense-making process and theorizing process. And this includes also transformative learning. Transformative learning also works in that way, although it embraces much more strongly also the emotional level of it. So really kind of through certain strong emotions, which can also be something like awe, you get into this liminal space where then ideally you have a joint meaning making together with others. And I do think that they're kind of if we stay just with this title or of the role of teacher, can be very supportive in holding, a safe enough space for joint meaning making, and also asking, questions to go deeper in a certain level of understanding. So I do think also through the method, although, and you alluded towards it, there is a certain degree of normativity in terms of where you'd like to go. And even if it means for the better of the world. So you don't want to leave it completely open. And this is very often a tension also in these
Mm,
learning processes. So how do you actually combine it with, let's say in certain areas, um, there is an agreement of what is right and wrong. And in other areas, there's the space to explore.
mm,
And I think through careful, space holding, facilitation, and especially guidance through questioning, you can nurture a kind of curiosity, which then becomes a kind of an innate capacity um, of the students to to take that forward in their lives.
it's like a battery, and I feel like the curiosity really is the battery that charges and fuels all exploration. I mean, a person who's curious can truly, I think, do anything. I mean, it's such a powerful force, and I think that's what I'm hearing you say, that it is that cultivation, which naturally it also seems like leads to this personal transformation also happening. I like that you said that creativity and curiosity are very tied together. And a lot of your work also revolves around this concept of like systems thinking, which is this concept we hear quite often, but I think it's actually hard to put an exact pin on what that exactly is. So I'm really curious to hear a little bit about what your definition of systems thinking is, and what is the opposite of systems thinking? Is there a word for that?
Mhm. I would say the opposite is probably, having a very narrow focus. Actually, coming to think of it, for me, microeconomics is probably the opposite of systems thinking, because you have this ceteris paribus assumption, everything else remains the same. Hmm? So you're focusing very narrowly on a specific question, and you leave out all the other factors. Because it makes it easier. It means that you can reduce a complex problem to something, maybe complicated or even simple. And you can really just go from problem to solution. And you do that. And this is, in a way, a kind of thinking that I would say also gets rewarded in our economic system, in schooling, where you focus on something very narrow, and then you just have a
Yeah.
solution to that. It's something which um, yeah, is very normal in our society. Now, just imagine, and some have said, today's solutions are tomorrow's problems, or many of them are. And I think it holds true if we look at, many things that have been done in the past. So, the solution to mobility issues is kind of uh, individualized mobility through cars, a solution of the past, which now causes a lot of problems. In agriculture, oh, not enough nutrients, let's just have
Mm,
some fertilizers, etc. And now, if you would come from a system thinking approach, you would kind of try not to reduce the complexity, but to embrace complexity. System thinking to me means, you really embrace complexity and the interconnectedness and interdependency of very many factors.
Mm.
And you also embrace that you can never fully control the system and you will never be able to anticipate all the effects of what you're doing. So instead, what you do when you come from a systems thinking approach, you try to really open up your gaze, your view, and for whatever you experiment with, you try to then observe what happens and what effect it has. And you can do that, of course, through different ways. You can do it through a very analytical approach, and you can do it through very embodied approaches like constellation work. And ideally, you combine these approaches, and then you recognize that whatever insight you think you may have is only ever a hypothesis, which you can then, test in certain ways.
Hmm. I feel like when I've been thinking about education, it started at a very, um, I guess for lack of the microeconomics approach. That's how I thought
Mhm.
about, okay, education's like this. How do we kind of work with this one problem? And through this podcast, what I've learned is every new guest kind of brings this new lens and a new perspective into which to look at education. And now I'm like, oh my God, I mean, to work with education, you have to work with food, you have to work with transportation, you have to work with economics, you have to work with all these different healthcare. It's not a single fixed problem at all. But what then ends up happening is then you kind of get into this place where you're like, okay, they all are interconnected. Where do I start? How do you figure out when you do understand that everything is interconnected? Where do you then go from there to know where you want to direct your energy and your work towards? How do you pick a starting point?
Mhm. Um, I think it is again, on the one hand side, curiosity. So where am I curious to explore and learn more? And the other thing is also, and this is of course now not not necessarily only being a student anymore. It is where am I asked to support? Where am I called to contribute? Who calls me to contribute and then to look at and what kind of contribution do I think I can make there? So it's in a way these two forces. One is being drawn to something by my own curiosity. Another thing is being pulled to something by someone coming and asking for support.
Hmm. So regardless whether one takes the systems approach to it or like this one particular issue, won't both of those people's actions at the end of the day be focused only on one particular thing? Even if the systems approach thinking allows you to think about it more holistically, you can still only act in one of those spaces or like a few. But so what would be the difference between two individuals who approach a problem in those two
Mhm.
lenses?
I think the difference is then, on the one hand side, in the maybe the scale of your action and the expectation towards you, the impact of your action. I think it's very different. If you go, for a systemic approach, you will be much more careful in a way and be much more listening to the system also. And you won't just go in and do something and go out again, right? But you will invest some time to actually get to know, be it the people, be it, the workings, the mechanisms there. And you will carefully start to make small, gentle steps and see the effect of those steps. On the other hand, you identify your problem, you bring in your solution, and you leave out, many of the factors, and maybe you leave again. And then kind of what the effects are from the solution that you brought, you don't feel responsible for that. Mm?
Mm,
And so you kind of come in and out. And so it's a very different energy that this creates, and I would say also very different effects that it has.
And so have you seen the impacts of these different types of thinking through your work at either Scaling for Good or World Ethic Forum?
Um, yes, I mean, so these are both areas where we try to take very systemic approaches. So let me talk about scaling for good. So scaling for good really emerged after my work with the climate knowledge and innovation community, where we really wanted to foster innovation and entrepreneurship for climate change mitigation and adaptation. So what we did there is kind of among different things, but we supported, for example, startups through both grants as well as coaching, so they can have their impact on the world. What we did then at Scaling for Good and why I co-founded it was more like, hey, there's already so many great things out there. So why does it always need to be new? Um, why don't we just aim to connect, the existing institutions and organizations and scale the impact instead of scaling anything else, the organization or the profit or whatever else. And so what that means is you immerse yourself also into a network and ecosystem, and you build that over years. So then, at some point where you actually bring the people together, you can just make calls or write emails and they come.
Mm,
Um, and there is a level of trust there where you can then really work with one another on a different level and start shifting also greater things. Start shifting, a whole city in terms of biodiversity. Hmm? How people engage with it, how the different actors think of it, including, the financial institutions, including the large institutional uh, owners of the built environment, etc. So it becomes slower, and it becomes much more effective.
mm. And so that's a lot of what your work at Scaling for Good does. What about at the World Ethic Forum?
At the World Ethic Forums, so one part which is really important is that we have embarked on a 7 years process with about 50 so-called firekeepers. So these are all people who are already very active, in their own communities, being as artists, be it as thought leaders, be it as activists. So coming from very different ways of engaging. And basically, what we're doing throughout these 7 years is kind of you're trying to create a very strong joint social field, where there is a certain coherence and which can ripple out. And we framed the whole thing as a participatory action research journey where we look into how to, create a culture of care and kinship by specifically looking at what are collective capacities, what are collective practices that foster that. Also, how do we connect to land and place, and how do we, include diverse voices? So this is kind
Mm,
of, the big framing, and all is rooted, I would say, in an ontology of ecocentrism, where everything is connected and interconnected, and you do no longer place the human on top of uh, the pyramid or a
mm.
pyramid.
This is really interesting. I mean, I think especially with climate change, and I'm drawing a lot of parallels with education, where what I'm hearing you say is that by having these groups and teams that work in research in all these different fields, any findings or change can be done at such a larger scale because it's not ever done in one particular silo. So it's never just going to be only policy. But if you have the research with the policy, with the technology, with the economics, I mean, it really allows for these changes to be done at such a larger scale because you are taking it from a systems approach. Would that be right?
Yes, yes, I would very much agree with that. And also, we probably know that from your own experience. When you come together with a diverse group of people, um, it's first of all, it challenges you in your own understanding.
Yeah.
And then and it's not so easy very often. But then sometimes there are these openings where suddenly, you know, through a collaborative process, there is really kind of this 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 emergence also of something which you could have never done on your own or just with a few of these people. And I think that is also what is really important to kind of bring up the whole capacity of the field.
Hmm. I mean, I want to come back to systemic change or systems thinking
Mhm.
because I think it is something that I'm very curious to understand how that can be implemented in a schooling system in particular. Because even when I think about collaboration. I mean, the amount of projects where we were really able to collaborate are so few. I mean, often it's what are your ideas? What are your thoughts on this? Try to figure out the problem in isolation by yourself. And if you're going to be in a group, be in a group of two or three. But it's never like being a group of hundreds, where it's like that's truly where the power of human really come through. It's not in the power even of two or three people. I mean, when you put 10, 20 people together, I mean, truly anything is possible. And so when I think about projects that are done at that scale, I mean, I've never been in a class where 30 people got together to work on something where so you don't even really develop your ability to think in that way because you never have to. And so what are your thoughts on how we can implement systems thinking into schooling?
Mm. I think is to actually really do it. Um, to have these collaborative, explorative, approaches. Um, and as you said, I mean, for me as well, it was, even at university, and when I thought about teamwork, it was like, okay, let's get together. Who does what? Okay, let's meet again before the presentation. Hmm? And that is how I used to also work. So kind of this experience of what it means to listen, what it means to really build on one another. What does it mean to do something, collaboratively and not with the teacher having in mind, what the outcome should be. So not kind of with, okay, let's all build a boat together and then we, cross the lake with the boat, right? This is again a very targeted thing and but kind of really something where the answer is not yet clear.
Hmm. I mean, this is what changed my understanding of knowledge and learning. I mean, when I went to the university, it was the first time I had ever heard that we had not discovered it all. I mean, up until that point, I truly believed every one of my algebra teachers was explaining to me everything that possibly was out there to know about algebra. We knew everything out there. And this is actually quite a simple thing. And I think a lot of people who have parents who may have been in academia might be able to pass this awareness on to their children. But my family, no one in my family is in academia. I mean, so this idea of what research even is, which is founded on this understanding that humans don't know much and there is so much more for us to know, was something that was so new to me. And when I learned that, I realized, oh, these teachers are just companions with us to go on this exploration together. They know so little more than I do. And it's not this, it's not this like gatekeeper who like needs to give me their award. It's we both are explorers in the same vast universe that we both don't know anything about. And I think what you're saying is so profound in that when you limit where a person's curiosity can go to, that's not real curiosity. I mean, you're only allowed to explore one particular area. I mean, truly to allow your brain to go in whatever direction it wants and to collaborate with those around you to come up with solutions. I mean, this is so powerful. I'm just shocked that it hasn't been done already. And I'm assuming there must be challenges, maybe in being able to convert it down to a grade. I'm not sure where the challenges are, but what would be so hard to go into a classroom of 10th graders or 11th graders and ask them, what are the biggest problems that you guys experience in your lives? Let's write a list down and let's go through each one of them. And for 3 months at a time, we will work with your physics teachers, with your math teachers to come up with the space for you guys to actually go explore this. I mean, that would be phenomenal.
Yes, indeed. And I do think, at least in the Swiss educational system by now, there have been some changes which go into that direction. But what I'm also observing is that it's then usually done, on an individual level, and then the students get time to explore something that they're really curious about, and they get support from the teacher. Um, and And what I think is not, or what I haven't seen being done, maybe it's also being done somewhere, is to this collaborative, inquiry. So
Hmm.
what does it mean to really, jointly follow our curiosity, also without necessarily having, just because you said, as an example, what is the problem? Maybe there is not a problem. Maybe it is just something, which um, fills us with joy, with awe, which just fuels our curiosity and where we would just love to explore. So I think it can also be that type of energy, and really where the teacher becomes a co-learner. In
Hmm.
unschooling, we always said that is, co-learning, kind of. That was one of the first principles always that we said, look, we're learning here together with each and every one of you.
Hmm.
We're just the ones who help a little bit in looking at our journey, but not, it is both fueled by your interests and we're learning alongside.
Hmm. The conference at Kaleido was about peace, and I'm really excited to kind of see what the intersection of these two look like. So when we talk about systems change, it often leads to these really big changes that can cause people to have these, I think about this with schooling, for example. I mean, there are so many people who find meaning and purpose through getting an A on every test. Doing well in school really gives them a sense of purpose. If you go through this large systems change where all of a sudden the entire way we look at schooling changes drastically, then all of a sudden you will always have a group of people who have a hard time letting go of what once was and accepting what now is, especially if they benefited from the system that once existed. And so when thinking about peace and systems change, what does it look like for the transition period to be peaceful when there will be people who will feel like they're being left behind?
Mm. Very good and important question, and I don't think I can fully answer it, huh? But I think, peace has also got to do with embodying and being peace. And also in terms of um, the great shifts which are necessary um, to be at peace. I mean, there's so much healing and restoration work to be done. There's, you know, decolonization really needs to happen in all kind of realms, and this doesn't just happen if we remain passive. So peace to me is also kind of actively assuming agency in this also transition period, or however we call it. I think it will always remain a transition period. For me, peace is not a it's not a static thing, but it's something very dynamic. And I do think it's important to actively also work towards the structural shifts that are needed in the system, which continues to discriminate on many different levels, and where we also have globally still the difference in income, the difference in the accumulation of wealth is just getting larger all the time. So there's a lot which is needed there to transition to peace. And so it's both the inner state and the way that we are interacting, which comes along this movement.
Mm. It's interesting because you even said peace is not static. It's so even the visual of peace usually is a calm, lake where there's no movement in the lake, right? I mean, everything, peace often it brings up this feeling of or visual of calm, something still. But it is really interesting if we could maybe redesign how we define peace to allow for it to also be chaotic. But I guess like an intentional chaos, an intentional kind of because change will lead to chaos. And so it is interesting. Have you ever thought a little bit about how peace could maybe even be chaotic?
No, a very interesting question. For me, the image of peace is something which is alive. Hmm? There is aliveness, there is joy, there is also death. You know, there is new life being born, there is composting. Kind of fully embracing kind of all of what life entails, which includes, of course, this. And at the same
Mm,
time, um, not there is no longer any structural discrimination. There is no longer extractivism. So it is kind of I'm just thinking of the word chaotic. Um, is it chaotic, or is it just a complex system at work? And when does the complexity of a system turn into chaos? And is that kind of, if we think of kind of a stable state of a system, then we often say there are these tipping points, and then it gets to a new stable point. At
mm,
least, often in systems modeling, that's what one talks about. And I'm just thinking, is it between this old and the new stable state where there is this chaos, where you kind of do not know what is going to be the new stable state?
mm.
Is it that which we're talking about? And then I'm actually thinking, is there ever really a stable state?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel like we're in a big period of globally a big period of transition right now?
Um, yes, and I think, we've been for many centuries, if not millennials, I do think that we're always, in a big transition. And of
I'm
course now,
tired. I'm
yeah.
I'm tired. I don't want to change anymore. The world is changing so fast. Can it like slow down for 10 seconds? It's insane. I'm so tired.
I think the thing which we can all do is to slow down ourselves, mm, by just, pausing. Pausing is a very, very important practice. So in order also for us not just to be continuously in this reactive mode, but actually being in a place of really responding and, embracing the change with curiosity and joy and leaning into it, you know.
Mm,
Um, and then also seeing, what is our role in that change? Where do we um, want to contribute? Where can we have an impact? Because, I'm very strongly convinced that, we should all be supporting the flourishing of life, human and more than human, beyond human. So, and that we do have this capacity to take on, to assume an active role and assume agency in that process.
mm. I'm going to end this conversation on the most important question, but I think this question itself takes 10 years to really get into somebody's ideas. But oftentimes, when we think about education, a big goal is human flourishing. We want people to flourish. But every person has a different definition for what that looks like because flourishing is so unique and it's the things that you aspire for that you end up projecting onto other people and saying this is what I think human flourishing is, but every person aspires for something different. And so it's hard to really think about from a global perspective what is human flourishing when cultures have different understandings of it. Can you get to some core essence of what that is? So in a lot of your work you do work on these big systems change to kind of move us into a quote unquote better world. And so, what do you feel like are some of the essential pieces of your better world? And in doing that, explaining a little bit about what human flourishing is.
Mhm. So, coming from a very ecocentric, perspective, it really means that the integrity of the functionality of the ecosystem is, in a way, maintained, of which humans are also part. So, for me, or to me, one big piece there is that humans have a role in the flourishing of ecosystem and that we assume this role again and take the responsibility instead of um, being the most destructive force, um, to become kind of a nourishing force, a force of regeneration, really. And so for me, there is an assumption, which is, of course, a big assumption, is that if we as humans come from an experience of intra-being, um, then we will act in a way that we are conducive to the regeneration of our ecosystems of which we are a part.
Hmm. And so, connecting, that seems like a lot of, what would you say are some of the metrics to look for to know whether we're doing that well or not? There's a lot.
Mhm. Um, well, if you would take now a concept like the planetary boundaries, you could look whether, the six planetary boundaries, which we have already overstepped, whether we manage to get within the planetary boundaries again. So, for example, the loss of biodiversity, whether we are able to hold the sixth mass extinction. I think that could be an easy, in
Hmm.
brackets, metric to look at.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, you could also look at it from a way that, let's say, in legal contexts, whether we acknowledge, to what degree we acknowledge also subjectivity of other than human beings, to what degree we acknowledge now rivers or mountains to also have a legal personality. So, so I think there's a lot in terms of the rights of nature that where we could also look at to what degree our systems are shifting, and of course the target setting in terms of, do we still aim just for economic growth, and do we still have the GDP growth as one of our main measures? You could also use the Gini coefficient in terms of the allocation both of wealth and income. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of different metrics that you could use, also the human development indicator, etc., which none of it on its own is a sufficient indicator and measure, but if you wanted to, you could use some of them in combination.
Well, this was a lovely conversation. I really want to thank you for, there were so many things that I think we could have gone on for much longer, but I would love to have you back on the show in the future and to touch more on some of these topics and learn more about what you have seen change in the last few years the next time we talk. But this was a lovely conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. There's so many areas that we started to dip our foot in, and yeah, thank you for hosting so beautifully.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.